and I used Google Docs to track everything. Built-in spaced repetition, which is like an approach to using flashcards that helps you retain the information over a long period of time. I created an approach for myself that I think really worked for me.
All right, so welcome everyone. Today we'll be talking with Brianna Tucker, who's a genetic counselor, a recent graduate, about how to create a study plan. Brianna, are you able to introduce yourself? And first of all, welcome. Thank you for
Thank you.
taking the time to speak with me. Are you able to just share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So, as Daniel just introduced me as, I'm Brianna. I am a recent graduate. I graduated from the Stanford Genetic Counseling Program in 2023 and have been working in rare disease research. So that is my kind of primary work at the moment. Other things about me, I'm from California, and I am very excited to be talking about my study planning and approach and how I went about getting through preparation for the board exam.
How did you go about the process of creating your study plan?
Yeah, so when I first started studying for the exam, I didn't quite have, I think, a very robust plan in place that was working for me. I knew that for me, the bigger issue was going to be studying a lot of content over a long period of time, retaining that information. And I think related to that, just sort of knowing what I was going to do every day when I sat down to study. So how I approached it was I first created a list of all the topics that I thought I needed to study based on the ABGC content outline, based on anecdotal advice I had gotten from people who had taken it before. And so after that, I ordered the topics based on things like, what do I feel like I struggle with the most? So I put those things first. And I put topics that I felt like maybe were a little easier for me. I then sort of ordered it so that there was like a harder topic and then maybe an easier topic and then a harder topic and then an easier topic. And I put a lot of the medical content first and then more of the like psychosocial, legal, those sort of topics later, because I felt like for me, I needed more time to review all of the medical sort of conditions and things like that. I have more to share, but Daniel, do you have any questions about anything that I mentioned so far?
Yeah, actually, so how far in advance did you start?
So my plan was to study 6 months before the exam. And that was advice I had received from my program. I know that it varies for different people, but that is the number that ended up working for me.
So in terms of your day-to-day schedule, what did that look like for you and sort of how did it change over time?
Yeah. So when I first started studying, my day to day looked like, okay, I'm going to spend today reading about prenatal, just say, and then I'm going to spend the next week doing the same thing.
Mm.
And then I'm going to switch to a different topic. And then maybe 2 months from now, or maybe a month from now, I'll do a review of everything that I've done. But I realized that that wasn't effective for me. Not only because I felt unsure about what I was doing, but also because I was concerned that I was going to forget everything I learned this month by like the end of the month.
Mm.
So I came up with a study approach by looking online. I looked up resources for how other people, for example, medical students study for their board exams. And so very high level, my approach became, well, I'm going to put together content outlines of like everything I want to know about prenatal or cancer or whatever content outline, content area. And then I'm going to spend time actively learning the material and creating flashcards. And then I would do that for one content area. And then I would move on to the next content area, but I would continue studying all of my flashcards from every content area every day. So I can talk more about that in detail, but essentially what my day-to-day looks like was dependent on that high-level plan, because I planned out what my 6 months were going to look like once I figured out that that was my approach. So I had a better idea of when I sat down today, I'm going to put together a content outline for this topic, and I'm going to do flashcard reviews. Tomorrow, I'm going to learn what I put on the content outline, and I'm also going to do flashcard reviews. So that kind of helped in that sense.
You mentioned flashcards. So there are different study tools that people will use to study. So are there other tools that perhaps you found effective, reading textbooks, highlighting, taking notes, or any other sort of specific techniques that you use to learn the material?
Yes. So I realized that there was a lot of content first of all. Second of all, there were definitely certain areas that I struggled with. So I had a long list of strategies that I referred to whenever I felt like I was struggling. So some of the tools I used were things like I used a flowchart tool. So when I was studying, for example, cancer conditions, and there were all the different like colorectal cancer predisposition syndromes, there's the different types of cancer that are associated with the different syndromes, but the lists are slightly different. So I was having trouble remembering, well, this condition has this types of cancer associated, and the same with this, but it's slightly different. So I came up with a flow chart that you could think of as mimicking like a differential in your head, maybe in clinic. But for me, it was helpful to build out the visual so that I could really internalize, okay, I can like practice, when I'm trying to actively remember the information, I can practice thinking like, okay, where was this on my chart? Things like that.
Was this an online flowchart tool, or what was it called?
Yes, I think it's called Lucid. But there's a lot of different types of similar tools. I don't think you have to use anything fancy. I think it's just something that kind of can help you put shapes together in lines and sort of draw connections. Um, oh, and then another strategy I used, I wrote a song
Yeah.
to remember all the teratogens and the effects that are linked to them. I was having trouble remembering all of them, just like looking at them as like a list. So I wrote a song to the Nations of the World Animaniacs tune. I will not sing it now because I'm a terrible singer. Sorry.
We'll be looking forward to the album coming out hopefully soon. But I mean that's great, and I really I'm really happy to hear that you were creative in your study approach. I think that a lot of times people will sort of stick to what they know, maybe to what's comfortable. Okay, they're like maybe they're going to read and highlight from a book, or maybe make some flashcards. But I think it's great to diversify your study approach, see what works, see what doesn't, right? And I imagine even for certain topics, there might be certain study tools that work better compared to other topics. So I don't know if that's something that you experienced either, if there were kind of specific domains where you found it useful to sort of change up your study approach.
Yeah, I think for me, it was really important to be creative and try to think outside the box in these cases because there were situations where, for example, I could rely on an experience I had in a rotation with a certain condition or group of conditions. And then I could rely on that to help me remember, like, oh, yeah, this one time I talked to a patient who had this sort of tumor and it reminds me of this condition. And so I can remember that way. Um, but I think it really was dependent on the topic and the condition and things like that. Also, really quick, I wanted to add on to the thing about flashcards. I think flashcards were really helpful for me. I used Anki. There's a lot of different flashcard tools that I think are helpful depending on what you're looking for. But I felt like Anki was really helpful because one, there are add-ons that I used to kind of add extra features that made it easier for me to use or made it more effective for me to use. But two, it has built-in space repetition, which is like an approach to using flashcards that helps you retain the information over a long period of time. So anyways, Anki was really helpful for me. And one more thing, I learned after building a bunch of flashcards that there are more effective ways of building flashcards. So I would suggest that people look up how to build effective flashcards.
Like how to build more effective Enki, is that, or
Even just in general, how to build effective flashcards.
Hmm, okay. How do you build those more effectively?
Yeah. So there were, for example, I'm trying to remember, it's been a little while now, but when I was reading about this, it seemed like there were ways where you could phrase the questions or prompts on your flashcards so that you could more effectively learn. And so, for example, if you put a prompt or question on there that was asking you to recall like a lot of information at once, then that was considered not as effective as if you kind of broke it down in a certain way. Happy to share more resources that I found in terms of building more effective flashcards. Maybe you could put that in the description, but yeah, it definitely helped me. So might be something that people can think about.
And I also wanted to ask about practice questions. How did you incorporate those? And at what point did you start with incorporating practice questions right from the beginning? Or kind of did you increase them more towards as you got closer to the exam? What are your thoughts around incorporating practice questions into your study schedule?
One of my strengths is answering test questions, which I know sounds kind of funny, but for me, the biggest challenge in studying for this exam was studying like regularly for such a long period of time and getting all that content into my head. So that means that for me, I didn't spend as much time doing practice questions and practice exams as might be helpful for somebody else. That being said, part of the issue was that when I was taking the newer version of the exam, there wasn't a ton of practice questions out there that seemed like they were relevant for this exam. So I did do practice questions that were from the resources that people sort of share. So I did, practice worksheets and practice quizzes and things like that. For me, it was more of a practice of how do I want to logically think through this question and think about the answers, like, the ones where you cross off the obvious answers and then you sort of think about the ones that are left, like which one makes more sense and how does this relate to the question. So for me, it was more about practicing working through the logic of a question versus doing a lot of practice questions that felt relevant for the actual exam that I took. But I did try to do some practice questions like interspersed in my 6 months, um, just to sort of reinforce, if I had just finished cancer, I tried to do some cancer questions to reinforce what I just learned. I did maybe one or two half practice exams, and I sort of did them in the middle of my studying, but I didn't want to do them too early because I felt like doing bad on them was going to make me feel less confident. Um,
Mm,
so for me, it felt more like doing practice questions was sufficient for me as it was interspersed throughout my studying.
that's really good to hear. And I appreciate you also bringing up the distinction between content knowledge, just actually knowing the content, and test taking strategy or test taking ability, if you will, which is something, well, I'll say both things can be learned or practiced. But just knowing, especially that the test taking strategies are something that for some folks, it doesn't come as naturally, or there may just not have been as much exposure previously to this type of exam. Having the stamina just to continue and stay focused throughout those 4 hours is tough.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just wanted to add on to that. When I said that for me, the struggle was more studying for that long and getting all that content in my head. When I said that I did less practice questions, it's because I knew I had a limited amount of time. And for me, it felt like it was going to be more effective for me to focus on how do I get all this content into my head and really stay like consistent with my studying. And so that was my bigger struggle. So I know it'll be different for different people.
Um, do you have any advice for how to go about creating a study plan, just an approach, or anything you wish you would have done?
I like to create very detailed plans about what am I going to be doing for this period of time when I'm working on this particular. So for me, and I mentioned before, like earlier in our recording, that I had started studying and felt like this isn't working for me and kind of pivoted and created a new study approach. I guess my advice would be to try to figure out your study approach and plan before you start, which sounds really obvious, but I think part of that might be things like talking to other people who have taken the exam, looking up resources online for how other people have studied for, and like I mentioned before, the like medical board exams. And Daniel, I had mentioned that I had a screenshot of what my study plan looked like. I'm happy to share it now if that would be helpful.
Yeah, yeah, that'd be great. Please go ahead.
Okay. And I'm gonna warn people that this might look a little overwhelming at first. So this was my high level overview plan for studying, and I used Google Docs to track everything. Um, you can also use Excel, but the topics that I had mentioned before that I ordered, I started with embryo, then med gen, then neuro, cancer, cardio, connective tissue, prenatal, yada yada, so on and so forth. And I ordered them again based on how hard I felt like they were, or, I felt like there was so much content in medical genetics that I had stuffed in there that I felt like I needed more time to review everything. So I put that earlier. Um, and I had a pretty significant prenatal rotation. So I felt like I was maybe more comfortable with that. I was more comfortable with cardio, so I put them later. Um, let's see what else to mention. I also tried. So one thing that Lindsay mentioned in the study rare course that I took was that reading the green book was very important. And I agree with that. So I also sort of broke that into chapters and sort of planned out how I was going to read that. I know that it can be kind of an overwhelming idea to read the entire book on top of everything else you have to read, but I felt like it was really helpful. So I actually incorporated that into my plan. Um, Yeah, so this is and then I included dates. So what I did when I first implemented this is I planned out, well, I think I'm going to spend this much time, on this topic and this much time on this topic. So here are the weeks that I'm going to, try to stay on this topic before I move on to the next one. Yeah, and Daniel, I can also explain very high level briefly like what my actual study approach was, but any questions on this so far that you feel like would be helpful for me to answer?
I'm wondering about the columns. So like prep, learn, and Anki. What do those mean, and how do you know when to check them off?
Yes. So for me, I mentioned a couple of times already that I looked at how other people have studied for exams like this. And based on what I read, I created an approach for myself that I think really worked for me. So I'm going to show the other image that I have. And hopefully this is not too confusing, but I'll walk you through it. So basically, the idea is that I used content outlines to put together, for example, like everything I wanted to know about prenatal, all of the general information, all of the markers and numbers and teratogens and like the conditions that I had seen in prenatal clinic, things like that. So I created an outline and I'll just like walk you through, like, for example, week 1. So I created a content outline for cancer and maybe I spent Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday on that. Um, and then after that, once I had all the content I wanted to know for cancer, I spent some time actively learning the information. So that meant going through my content outline and really trying to understand, well, why is it that there are these like certain questions that we're asking when we're taking a family history? And what are the different conditions that I'm learning here? And while I did that, I also created my flashcards. And then I started reviewing my flashcards. And the flashcard review, like I mentioned, there's a approach called spaced repetition. So what would happen is just say I did cancer in week 1. Well, once I moved to week 2, once I was done with cancer, I would start putting together my content outline for prenatal. And then I would also, on the days that I was working on that, do my flashcard review for cancer. Once I was done putting together my content for prenatal, then I would start learning prenatal and creating my flashcards for prenatal. But of course, every day I was also doing flashcard review. And by this point, because I was adding prenatal cards to my flashcard, um, like all my flashcards together, then I would be studying cancer and prenatal. Hopefully that wasn't too like confusing, but the idea is that there is a process of putting together the content, but then learning and reviewing the content. And the idea with the flashcard reviews over time is that you're adding cards from each content area, but you're not studying every single flashcard every single day that you study. When you're using the spaced repetition approach, it means that, or what happens is that you study a certain number of cards. The ones that become easier for you, you don't see again until like maybe a week or two later. The ones that are harder for you, you'll see more frequently. And the idea is that there's like space between when you review each flashcard to help you have to actively recall the cards. And then that helps you remember them better. So anyways, I could talk more about that later, but yeah, any questions that would be helpful for me to answer on this?
For the learn days, sort
Mhm.
of what did those look like for you? Was it reading, watching videos?
Yes, all of the above. So learning meant I would read through the content outlines I created, and for the sections on the content outline, I would think very critically about like, what do I need to get out of this? How do I make connections to understand like why this is important? But in practice, what it looked like was not only reading through the content outline, but actively trying to start committing it to memory. And then on top of that, also understand why is it that these numbers indicate this or these lab values indicate this. For example, I would try to come up with memory tools, or I would also come up with like acronyms, or like I mentioned, the song, or I would come up with, or this is where I would like create my flowcharts, or sometimes I would create like a PowerPoint slide, or I would create like role play scenarios and I would like talk through them with someone who wasn't as familiar with genetics. So I used a lot of different strategies just to start like learning and trying to like commit to my memory and sort of create the structures in my head that like made everything make sense and like be connected. I wasn't at that point trying to like memorize everything. That was what the flashcard review is for. Again, not like memorize, but just sort of like commit to memory. That me the same thing, but you know what I mean? Like I feel like there's a difference between learning and remembering and then like memorizing. So
And I think that you're right, especially for the new exam. There's only a small minority of questions that are recall. I see it looks like you have one more slide. Is that the case?
this was a basic sort of progress tracker that I also added to my planner. Um, I have mentioned a couple times that the harder part for me for this preparation was studying consistently for 6 months. And so for me, especially once I started working, so for me, it meant that I needed to build in some extra accountability and structure. And so for me, that meant creating this countdown progress tracker where I could check off every day I studied. And then the bar would turn from red to yellow to green the more days I studied per week. And so I was always thinking, well, I don't want my bar to be red or yellow this week, so I have to study today. Which, side note, another really, really helpful thing I did was study with one of my classmates, Michaela, and having that accountability and having someone just sort of like there while I was studying was really helpful for accountability. So, just another tip.
This is great. Having some type of tool to remind you, just to keep you on track, keep you on schedule is really important when you are running a marathon, which is what you're doing when you're studying for this exam. This is a great example of a system, and really what we've been talking about this whole conversation,
Mhm.
a system, Brianna, that you've created to, as you mentioned, keep yourself on track.
Yeah, I also want to add, I think that it could be hard sometimes to have a plan and then stick to the plan and then have days where things are hard or maybe things don't go according to plan. So I also want to say to people that it's okay if things don't go according to plan. Um, you can make some adjustments, sort of figure out, okay, I didn't quite get as much done today as I wanted to. How can I make adjustments to the rest of the week? I also want to add my plan did not go perfectly, even though everything looks very organized. I actually did not finish studying as much as I had wanted to. Um, and and it turned out okay, but it might not be perfect, and that's okay.
Mm. That's great advice. And I think those are great concluding words as well, sending us off on a positive note. I really appreciate your time, all the insight that you provided into your approach for creating a study plan. I think it's really valuable to see kind of in detail what are the resources, the approaches that you used. I just want to thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today. Um, and congratulations also passing.
And I really enjoyed talking with you today about this, and happy to answer questions about what I did or even share like a blank template of the tracker that I made and things like that. So if people are interested, um, I think you're planning to put some details in the description, the video description. So
Yep. Yeah, we'll put a link to Brianna's study planner and some of the resources that she mentioned in the description.
great. Well, thanks, Daniel.
All right. Thank you.